Greetings, animals. Hope you're well. Give me a few moments here to get the stream in order, and we'll get started. Continue reading. Definitely past the halfway mark on the book now. Lots of notes on the pages coming up, so we'll see how that goes. I don't know, actually, this next section is mostly good stuff. It's a little bit later in the book, or I might get cantankerous again, we'll see. Alright. I think we're good here. We are live streaming on Odysee as well. I try and do all of my live streams crossed over to Odysee now, except for the morning think times. So if you are interested in supporting us on a platform that isn't Google-based or YouTube-based, there's a link in the description that'll take you to the Odysee stream. All right, let's get started. This chapter is corporatism. Under modern society, almost everything is owned by corporations. I think the majority of property is government land right now. Could be wrong on that. It's close if it's not government as number one, but whatever. Corporations have many forms, including limited liability companies. They are so prevalent that people forget that all corporations are creatures created by government and could not exist in their current form without government. Okay, so let's get nerdy and detailed with this. The reason why a lot of property is owned by corporations is because people seek the protection of government guns through corporate licensing. It's not like people form corporations without just for like their own sort of corporate selfhood, personhood reasons. If you don't get the guns of government behind your corporation, then you can be treated poorly by the government in a lot of different ways. You can get extorted more in the form of taxes. You can even be forcibly shut down if you don't get the appropriate licensure. They are so prevalent that people forget that all corporations are creatures created by government. Corporations existed absent of any government for a time, in between sort of the fall of Rome and sort of the Enlightenment age, sort of in the medieval times era. Voluntary corporations are just associations of people working under a common name, voluntarily contracting with people and doing business. Corporations do not exclusively exist as a government entity, but that said, he's correct when he says that they could not exist in their current form without government. And certainly all modern corporations are creatures backed by the guns of government. It's like it's a form of regulatory capture, right? They took a method of associating between people that already existed absent the government, and they regulated it and said, well, we need government to make this safer. And then once government had been doing it long enough, now people forget that they can do it without the government, kind of like the roads. It's like the government has taken over the job of building all the roads, and so now people don't even consider that they could build a road themselves, and they don't need the government to be the only one building roads. Same thing with this corporation stuff. But yeah, I think his point stands that corporations in their current form could not exist without government. So, he says, the question becomes, how do corporations relate to true democracy? In earlier chapters, I outlined the importance of maintaining rules of relative power along with low coupling and high encapsulation. I also introduced Dunbar's number, which lends credence to natural limits in the scalability of power within organizations. I introduced the goal of designing for independence and anti-fragility. All of these things lead to designing government around largely independent, small countries of about 50,000 people, which are also divided into smaller districts of about 1,000 people. These counties as countries can form federations to create states, and the states can form federations, such as the United States. In the process of modularizing government, we are left with a world where individual corporations are still employing millions of people. This creates a situation where one person, the CEO, effectively guides the efforts of millions. This makes the CEO more powerful than the leaders of many small countries. The revenue of major companies is also greater than the GDP of many countries. How democratic is that? Well, why is it a bad thing if it's voluntary? Like, that which is non-democratic is not necessarily a bad thing. As long as it's voluntary. It's about voluntary. It's about consent. This is me talking. The leaders of major companies join communities such as the World Economic Forum, where they coordinate policies and agendas. The major companies are often interdependent upon each other and are all dependent on the banking system. They all benefit from increasing the dependence of the population upon their services and undermining competition. The result is that corporate giants govern almost every good or service the majority of us consume. How can any country of 50,000 people license the operation of a global company of 5 million people? What would happen if Walmart had to incorporate a wholly owned subsidiary in every micro-jurisdiction? Imagine if a single person was able to simultaneously be a citizen of every country in the world. What would happen if each jurisdiction forbade companies owned by foreigners from operating in their territory? What would happen if each jurisdiction forbade companies owned by foreigners from operating in their territory? Well, division of labor would be destroyed. The progress of modern technology would grind to a halt. What would life be like without giant international corporations? Could big projects ever get funding? War is what it would look like. War is what it would look. That's what it would look like if what's the saying? If trade goods doesn't cross borders, armies will. What up, Patrick? I see you in the comments. What does any of that have to do with the topic of this video? You just bungee into videos and just copy paste stuff? Like, what does that have to do with what I'm reading? Come on, man. Come on. Stay on topic. These are tough questions, which would take an entire book to explore. There is a codependent relationship between big business and big government. That is true. When big business captures the governance of a society, the result is crony capitalism. In many ways, big companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Walmart, Facebook, and the major media have more power over the lives of people than government. Consider that Twitter, Facebook, and the major media, how did he use the word power there? They have more power over the lives of people than government. Yet those companies, aside from the checks that they cash from the government, they don't point guns at anybody. So I think you'd be hard-pressed to make the case that they have less power than the government, who does point guns at people. But again, power is undefined. Consider that Twitter, Facebook, and the major media actively censored a sitting president of the United States. Because they are considered private, they can do things that, in theory, the government is not allowed to do. Well, it's their property. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect to large companies is that they give the government leverage over all their customers by applying pressure to the executive team. Yes, and we have definitely seen this over the past year and a half with COVID. Yes. The COVID mandates in most locations were not directly on the people, they were on the businesses open to the public. And the pressure was applied through threatening to revoke their business license. Instead of having to censor millions of people with individual criminal charges, governments could simply hold a handful of companies liable, and the companies do the censorship. Governments censor everything, including speech, products, and services. What is more, often the executives of the corporations people depend on start to act as a government unto themselves. I think you have to, the burden of proof is on you to prove that There's a corporation out there that points guns at people. Because that is the distinctive trait of government. The non-consensual coercive control of a group of people in a geographical area is how I define government, though he might define it differently. Corporate personhood and limited liability. Let's start this exploration by reviewing the nature of a company and corporate personhood. The general idea is that a group of people can come together and own a company. Everything titled to the company is indirectly owned by the people who own the company. The smallest company is owned and operated by a single person. Often these are organized as limited liability companies. One moment. Okay. Sorry, I lost my spot. The general idea is that a group of people can come together and own a company. Everything titled to the company is indirectly owned by the people who own the company. The smallest company is owned and operated by a single person. Often these are organized as limited liability companies, but almost any corporate structure can be owned and operated by a single individual. Now, suppose that a billionaire crashes his car into your house. In theory, the courts would make him liable for all damages, and because he has ample assets to pay the damages, you get reimbursed. Imagine instead that the billionaire formed an LLC to operate a delivery service. He buys his truck under the LLC. One day he's making a delivery and crashes the truck into your house. The LLC has no assets other than the now totaled truck, so even if you sue and win, you don't get paid. For the sake of argument, I'm assuming the insurance bill went unpaid. In effect, the creation of the LLC was a low-cost insurance policy for the billionaire, which is paid for by anyone who is harmed by his business practices. This is a form of moral hazard. In the extreme case, companies like BP drill for oil in the Gulf of Mexico, and when their well fails, it causes trillions of dollars of damages and destroys vast ecosystems. All corporations exist under the peace treaty of a democratic society. Well, they don't have to. All current corporations exist that way, but that's not a proscriptive statement. That's a descriptive statement. The question becomes, if corporations are to be licensed, so we're going to include this as a necessary premise going forward, even though it's not. Okay, let's just keep that in mind. The question becomes, if corporations are to be licensed, at what level of the many layers of democratic society should the license be given? If a license is given, what benefits do the people get by allowing some people to operate with limited liability? I don't think that's... as long as it's consensual, people can associate in whatever ways they want. And if they want to consensually, contractually agree to hold somebody to a limited liability, then they can do so as individuals or as groups of people consensually acting together. You don't have to codify this into some societal stratification. How does such a society defend against the moral hazard created by limited liability? By not codifying it into a stratification. That's one way. By not centralizing this decision. By not having a central authority provide limited liability. Let people individually associate as they choose. That would severely limit limited liability. There are some good things that come out of limited liability, namely investments and stockholding and things like that that assist companies in raising funds to grow. So getting rid of limited liability would very likely hurt business. But sort of the version of limited liability that the government forcibly imposes on everyone today is too far. It's harmful. And it's coercive. Alternatively, if a democratic society does not recognize corporate personhood, how would companies be formed, and would they undermine the democratic power of the people? How would companies be formed, and would they undermine the democratic power of the people? I'm not sure that's even a concern to be had. Heads, I win, tails, you lose. When society grants some people the right to operate a company with limited liability, it creates a moral hazard. All businesses entail risks, and some of those risks can be damages in excess of the money invested. This is especially true in the case of pollution, which harms billions of people by small amounts. Imagine a speculator formed a company with limited liability and funds it with $100. The speculator has a business plan that will either make him $1,000 or create tort liabilities of $1,000 with 50-50 odds. Without limited liability, the business operates at break even because the times it makes $1,000 cover the losses from the times it loses $1,000. With limited liability, the business is now profitable because instead of losing $1,000, it only loses $100. On average, it is now earning $950 per flip of the coin. The losses didn't disappear, they were just transferred to other people, the victims of the business's activity. That's true. That's a problem with the modern conception of limited liability corporations created through government. Yes. A business will take far greater risks knowing that the downside of its... And that was actually a really clearly explained example. Well done. He did very well there. A business will take far greater risks knowing that the downside of its gambles are covered. These losses are paid by the people who granted the company limited liability. What benefit did the people get? After all, 70% of businesses fail within the first 10 years, and on a long enough timeline, most businesses eventually fail. The bigger they get, the bigger the failure. Sometimes companies get so big that people think of them as too big to fail, at which point governments don't just limit the liability, passing losses on to the creditors and or victims. They create the negative liability company, where the whole population collectively covers the losses of operating the business at a loss. These are known as zombie companies. Insiders spend years siphoning off short-term profits while accruing long-term risks, and then we, the people, spend years paying the losses from these long-term risks. The political support for zombie companies comes from the millions of people who stand to lose money by letting them fail. While a company is operating, people get the benefit of the services of the company. The theory goes that without limited liability, many people would not start companies. Imagine you had $4 billion in the bank and you wanted to start a social media company. Imagine that the cost to build the company is $10 million. Now, consider that there are ambiguous and contradictory laws which could potentially cost the company all $4 billion in tort liabilities. Let's assume the social media business, if successful, 50% chance, would be worth $100 million in 5 years. Do you invest in the company and risk $4 billion? What if you only had $10 million and your worst case is filing bankruptcy? Would you invest then? At a certain point, an individual accumulates enough wealth that doing anything with potentially unlimited liabilities is not worth the investment. When you are poor and have nothing to lose, then the investment calculus is very different. From a certain perspective, every person could be viewed as a limited liability company. If they die and don't have assets, then there's nothing you can do to collect debts or damages. Should we allow people to have multiple virtual lives? Should we allow the moral hazard to multiply? At least with the natural limited liability of a single person, their interest in remaining alive is aligned with your interest in getting paid. Each person only gets a single reputation, and each person is only capable of so much damage on their own. Furthermore, the maximum damage a typical person can do is relatively small compared to the damage a billionaire could do if you grant him limited liability. The question becomes, should society allow some people to take risks that could cause more in damages than they're able to pay? Should BP be expected to post a $1 trillion bond before drilling in the Gulf of Mexico? Should a billionaire be shielded from the liability of pollution just because he polluted under an LLC he owns? Should ordinary people be able to invest in stocks of companies doing dangerous, illegal, or otherwise harmful activities for a profit without having exposure to more than the loss of their investment? Private property solves literally all of those questions. So Generally, you would not want to sign a contract limiting the liability of a company drilling in your ocean, because if they screwed it up and released tons of oil into your piece of the ocean, that would be very damaging to your assets, so you would not sign that contract. Should ordinary people be able to invest in stocks of companies doing dangerous, illegal, or otherwise harmful activities for a profit without having exposure to more than the loss of their investment? Well, I could take on, as the CEO or the board, let's say a board member, I could take on when investors join the company, I could contractually sort of take on the risk, the added risk of, whatever the net worth of the investors were, to shield my tiny micro investor individual people from their liability. I could do that voluntarily, and sort of people would have to come at my assets before getting at theirs. That might be one way to do it voluntarily. But yeah, all of this stuff is solved through contract and private property, and also a severely limited version of limited liability that could exist consensually. Consent is key, as always. Limited liability is a huge moral hazard, and it isn't clear how society is compensated for the risks it takes in extending the privilege. How else can we get the benefits of limited liability? What would it look like if, instead of the population carrying the cost, individuals contracting among themselves could exchange the risks without creating special privileges? One potential mitigation to this moral hazard is to better compensate those who carry the risk, we the people. Every company has upside potential, which is currently going to the owners, while the downside is going to the people. What if the people got to participate in the upside of every business as the price of the insurance provided by limited liability? This would look like a company forced to issue shares to everyone in the country on an annual basis as the insurance premium. We're just talking about taxes here. In effect, it would create a universal income for the population in exchange for the limited liability. More on this in the next chapter on allocating natural resources. People willing to take responsibility and operate without limited liability would have a competitive advantage because they wouldn't have to pay for insurance. Look, if you want to offer your customers this arrangement, you can do that. Fine, as long as it's consensual. And I don't think he's talking about forcing a non-consensual agreement for this tax welfare system on people. I don't think he's talking about forcing that on companies. But look, as long as all this is voluntary, fine. You can try whatever mechanism you want. I'm not sure that would be successful, but who knows? I could be wrong. Wealth versus power. This is the next chapter. No discussion of democracy and decentralization of power is complete without addressing the relationship between wealth and power. What good is a theory of true democracy if money rules the world? Okay, well, being pedantic again, money cannot rule anything. It's an inanimate object. But I think we see what he's saying here. How is the idea that all people should have equal democratic power different from saying that all people should have equal wealth? I don't know. You still haven't defined power. Democratic power? What is this? Voting power? If it's consensual? I don't. This is messy conceptual comparisons happening. Many people focus on, let me try and read this, transposing the language out of collectivism, and see if I get some clarity on it. What good is a theory of true democracy if money rules the world? How is the idea that all people should have equal democratic power different from saying all people should have equal wealth? Let me think about this. This just seems like personal consent in succession with extra steps. Like when I boil that statement down, it's just like, okay, we're just talking about everybody should be equally able to secede and have voluntary relationships. What is, how is that different from having equal wealth? You can be completely poor and destitute and barely functional as a productive individual, and you should still have the right to secede. I don't know, man. Let's continue. Many people focus on the distribution of wealth in society while ignoring the distribution of power. It is individual power, manpower, which creates wealth, not individual wealth, which creates power. All the wealth in the world is meaningless without the manpower to maintain it. With all the power in the world, you can create all the wealth in the world. All wealth that ever existed was created by someone exercising their manpower to produce more value than they consume. Power is ultimately derived from the law of the jungle, and it is manpower that enables the production of wealth. I have no fucking idea anymore when he says the word power what he means in this book. It seems to change constantly. Power is derived from the power is ultimately derived from the law of the jungle. Okay, so when he's used power in this book, he means non-consensual force, because if that's his definition of power, then he's been wrong a lot in this book in the ways he's talked about power. So I think my issue with his usage of the word power is coming to a head right there. If that is his definition, power is the law of the jungle, force, non-consensual force, or force used absent any consideration of consent. If that is his definition of power, then he has used power really messily so far in this book. And if I wanted to be really detailed about it, I would go read the book again now with that conception of power and be able to critique each usage of it in reflection of that definition that we got over halfway through the book. That's really frustrating. I would like to introduce an analogy to physics, where power equals energy over time. P equals E over seconds. P equals E over seconds. Wealth is potential energy, stored energy, or savings. Power is the rate at which you can generate energy or utilize stored energy to affect change in the world. I swear to God, we just got another definition of power. Oh, man. Power is the rate at which you can generate energy or utilize stored energy to affect change in the world. Well, then it is a hopelessly subjective concept now. And he didn't mention consent in the ability to affect change in the world. I don't know. I get more confused on the term as we go. All life forms can be viewed as converting raw materials and energy, heat, solar, etc., into higher energy states, potential energy, savings, or fat. In effect, people are like solar panels or wind turbines that produce value, energy, at different rates over time based upon different inputs. Each of us must determine how we use our manpower and the resulting value stream, energy, we produce. Do we use it to charge our batteries or someone else's? Do we use it to power our house or someone else's? One moment, please. All right. We can use our solar power to live in the moment, but if we lack sufficient reserves, then we will eventually starve when a cloud passes over or the sun sets. If we ever need a surge of power to start a motor, then solar power may not be sufficient. Since this is not a desirable outcome, every living being spends some or most of their surplus solar power to charge their batteries, build savings, and fat. With savings, we have increased independence and can survive a passing cloud, dark night, long winter, or short-term demand for a large amount of power. There is only so much we can store in our own batteries. After all, batteries wear out and lose their charge over time. Jesus highlights this when he says, quote, "Do not store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but instead store for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal." You do not have to take this literally to gain value from it. Consider heavenly savings to be the goodwill of your community earned by being a reliable, trustworthy, and giving community member. When your earthly savings fail you, your heavenly savings can bail you out. This is what community is all about. Storing up treasures in heaven is like a solar power system connected to the power grid. When your batteries are full and you have surplus power, you sell it to the grid. And when your batteries are low and the sun isn't shining, you buy from the grid. Even with the power grid, people still need their own savings. The power grid isn't always reliable, and each person needs leverage to negotiate rates. Without individual savings, the power company, society, can extort you when you need to buy, and without the ability to save, the power company can extort you when you need to sell. One of the goals of true democracy and sound money is to create a more reliable social power grid via a truly democratic peace treaty. Energy can take many different forms: heat, kinetic, electric, chemical, etc. People are energy generators and energy converters. In social terms, we utilize energy in many forms, including money, social capital, debts, tangible goods, knowledge, loyalty, weapons, and health. Each day, we choose where we direct our energy generation, manpower, and consumption by how we spend our time, by what products we buy, and by what we choose to save. If we are not careful, we can become generators powering many parasitic loads. Democratic power is a large number of people giving a small portion of their generative capacity to a single person for a time. Democratic power is a large number of people giving a small portion of their generative capacity to a single person for a time. Okay. It seems to be equivocating energy over time with authority. Democratic power is more equivalent to authority than it is collectivized generative capacity. Unless he's talking true democracy, but he didn't say true democracy. He said normal democratic power. Man, these are messy languages. So democratic power is a large number of people giving consensual. I'm adding the words. I'm going to try and massage this into something that makes sense to me, and then maybe we can compare and see if this is what he means. This is me trying to figure out what he means. Does he mean consensual democratic power is a large number of people giving a small portion of their authority to a single person for a time? That sentence makes sense, I suppose. I don't know. Moving on. This power can be used directly to create an army to meet the desires today, or it can be used to produce and store things of value. It leverages the real-time power of people contributing their time and obedience to affect change in a coordinated direction. The leader has access to this real-time manpower. It is like having a massive field of solar panels to power any loads you like. More importantly, it does not depend upon the wealth of the people. It exists even among destitute populations if they are willing to obey and serve their leaders. Okay. Pedantic time, engage. I don't know if this is pedantic or not. This language is unacceptable in as far as I'm concerned. The words obey and the word serve are related to rulers, not leaders. Leaders are followed. Leaders are joined. So it exists even among destitute populations if they're willing to follow and join their leaders. Or it exists even among destitute populations if they're willing to obey and serve their rulers. Those would be the two versions of that sentence that made sense. Obey and serve are not voluntary consensual words. Oh, man. Red flags. Hackles are up. Economic power is utilizing savings to rent the generative capacity of other people. You give something of relatively lower value to you to get something of relatively higher value to you. Both parties believe they are getting something they value more than they are giving up. Economic power can be used to invest, thereby creating more economic power. Alternatively, economic power can be consumed for enjoyment or control over others. Democratic power is often converted to economic power by taxing the people and then using the value produced to purchase the generative capacity of government employees. Tyranny generally depends upon consumptive use of energy and savings. If people remove their voluntary contribution, then tyrants must rely upon their savings to maintain their power, and all of the savings in the world are powerless next to the generative power of the masses working together. If a tyrant is using your generative power against you, then the solution is to heed the call of John Galt and take the pledge. Quote, I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine. Economic collapse is how most tyrannies end, whether it is the tyranny of a mob or the tyranny of a king. John Galt called on the critical 4%, Pareto, to go on strike in order to stop the motor of the world. By removing the tax base, of which 4% contribute over 64% of the revenue, the government loses economic power to purchase the manpower of economic mercenaries. Note that the concept of tax base is much broader than just the money the government takes from you. If you are a critical employee at the power plant, the government may take 50% of your paycheck, but your labor and creativity are producing much more value for the power company than the equivalent of your paycheck. If this wasn't true, then you would be a net loss for your employer. If the rest of society is using that surplus value to oppress you, then your true tax rate is the difference between the value you are producing for the rulers and the value society is providing to you. That was well said. I like that. People convert their energy into wealth through their labor and creativity. Wealth concentrates when a business owner pays someone $1 to use their manpower to create $2 of value for the business. A person who hires 100 employees will generate $200 in value at a cost of $100. In terms of Pareto, the business owner now has as much wealth as the other 100 people combined. 1% of the people control 50% of the wealth. Without the entrepreneur, the 100 people wouldn't have had the job, and society would be less effective in converting manpower to value. If those people had a better opportunity, they would have spent their time doing something else and earning less than $100. Going to refresh my Odysee stream just to make sure. I don't think it is working. I just want to make sure we're good there. Maybe say hello in chat or something over on Odysee for those watching there. Just let me know if it's working. Appreciate you. I like making sure Odysee is the one functioning, you know? All right. Without people generating power, wealth, stored energy, will decline. Wealth is like a battery with a self-discharge rate. Imagine for a moment that you were the last man on Earth. You have 100% of all wealth, but only one manpower. In what direction will your wealth trend? Could you maintain everything, or will nature cause rust and decay to destroy almost everything you consider wealth? In the grand scheme of things, what does this imply about what is necessary to lift people out of poverty? What is more important, the wealth that people have today or where they spend their manpower? As soon as people take responsibility for using their power to produce personal independence, they start building their savings and reducing the economic power of the tyrant. That was well said. I like that a lot. As soon as people take responsibility for using their power to produce personal independence, they start building their savings and reducing the economic power of the tyrant. That's really good stuff. Independence increases your ability to capture your own generative power. The idea I'm trying to get across in this chapter is that democratic power, manpower, is the root of all power. God damn it. What? 2 pages prior, power is ultimately derived from the law of the jungle. 2 pages after, democratic power is the root of all power. We are approaching nonsense thresholds with this word power. Okay? It's getting frustrating. All right. That wealth is not a sustainable source of power, and that wealth equalization only serves to deplete the batteries of society and does nothing to fix the misaligned deployment of the generative power of the masses. If the masses attempt to maintain wealth equalization, then it is like a giant short circuit. All the generative power of the masses is flowing to the leaders, and the leaders use this generative power against the accumulation of savings, economic power, and personal independence. That said, economic power is real in the same way that power from a battery is just as real as power from solar panels. My note that I wrote on the side of the page from the first time I read this book, I highlighted this sentence. The sentence I just read, that said, economic power is real in the same way that power from a battery is just as real as power from solar panels. My note in the margin was, I am lost in the long-ass list of ways the word power has been used in this book. I don't even know what it means anymore. Oh, man. Power from a battery is just as real as power from solar panels. So economic power is real in the same way. The key is that even economic power is limited by the ability of people to draw down the batteries. All the wealth in the world is powerless without people motivated by it to do the will of the owner of the wealth. That seems to equate power to wealth. The owner is powerless to increase the wealth of society without the creative and entrepreneurial insight on how to direct the manpower of the people. What's up, Remco? Hey, thanks for that. Oh, crap. What do they call them? They call them hyper chats on Odysee. Thank you for your hyper chat, sir. I appreciate it. It's cool to see that working. I love it so much better than YouTube. That's so cool. Good to see you, Remco. All right. I wonder what the delay is. I think it's like 30 seconds. As soon as you hear me say this word, type something. 1, 2, 3, this word. And I will count to see how long it takes to appear. I'm curious what Odyssee's delay is. All right. Corporate exploitation of workers. Do companies exploit workers by paying them less than the value they produce? Let's investigate. Imagine there are 1,000 people capable of doing a job that produces $10 of value for a company. The company only has to pay as much as the lowest bidder. If the lowest bid was $1, then the employer earns $9 on the labor of the individual. Is this exploitation or something else? The inability of the 1,000 people to coordinate results in a transfer of power to the employer who is coordinated. What do you mean? What is power? What's being transferred? If the 1,000 people could cooperate, then they could perhaps extract $9 from the employer who still profits by $1. This is a classic prisoner's dilemma. The questions are, if and how should they coordinate to better capture the value of their labor? Got to be careful. Labor doesn't have inherent value. Consider if the situation was reversed. Imagine all the producers of food coordinated to raise prices. Imagine if all the producers of cloths could coordinate. Clothes. That word was clothes, and I just can't read. The ability to raise prices by coordinating is derived from the creation of a monopoly. A worker's monopoly might be an answer to an employer's monopoly, but perhaps we should address why the employer has a monopoly in the first place. The first thing to consider is that any employer able to generate a 10x return on salaries has huge margins. This should encourage competition from other employers producing competing products or services. These competing employers will bid up the salaries of workers and lower the cost of goods to customers. This will continue until the profit to the employer is commensurate to the risk taken. That said, there are natural and artificial barriers to entry that give those with capital an advantage in utilizing labor. Oh, I'm looking forward to this explanation. Consider a ditch digging company which owns the only backhoe in town. Assume one person with a backhoe can dig as much in an hour as 100 people with shovels. If digging a ditch earns $100, the backhoe owner can either pay someone $1 to operate the backhoe or 100 people $1 to operate a shovel. The backhoe operator earns $99 for every hour the backhoe operates. Is this exploitation? The backhoe owner had to buy the backhoe. You're over 2-minute delay? It keeps buffering? How's your internet connection? Yeah, that was at least 2 minutes. That was a long time. That sucks. I think I'm sending 3,000 kilobits to Odysee, so most internet connections should be able to handle that, but I don't know, maybe I should drop the stream quality to Odysee even more if they can't handle it. The backhoe owner had to buy the backhoe, which means his actual costs include the labor required to build the backhoe. Only once the backhoe earns enough to pay for itself does its owner start to see his profits grow. And I recently discovered just how expensive backhoes are. Like, these are equivalent to like Mercedes. These things are expensive. We can see that markets appear to balance things so long as there is competition. Competition assumes that all resources can be procured from multiple independent sources. If competition can be restricted, then it's like a backhoe owner that prevents anyone else from operating backhoes. Those who monopolize business areas gain the upper hand over labor. Note that intellectual property is nothing but a legal monopoly, and the consequence is that owners of IP get the upper hand over labor. I address IP in an upcoming chapter. I think I wish he had mentioned consent in that paragraph, because as long as I'm not pointing guns at anybody to prevent them from building or buying or constructing their own backhoe manufacturing company, then I am not a criminal in any way. I've not done anything wrong. I'm not exploiting anybody. If I'm threatening people, that's a problem. Earlier, we described the measure of a true democracy as the ability of people to reach a new consensus. The ability to effect change. Dinos work to undermine the power of people to reach a new consensus. They seek to maintain their monopoly on consensus. This whole book is dedicated to exploring how people can organize themselves to maintain their ability to reach a new consensus and effect change. It is dedicated to exploring means of escaping the prisoner's dilemma. Can any of the techniques we have learned help workers trapped in a prisoner's dilemma? The typical response is for the workers to form a union. A union enables collective bargaining with the goal of creating a monopoly on the skills required by a company. To evaluate whether unions are the solution, we must ask whether they comply with the principles of democracy and the principles of minimizing moral hazard. Is membership in the union voluntary? If not, then it violates democratic principles. Do all members of the union make the same pay? If so, the result is the same as the dinner party splitting the bill, only in reverse. Instead of each person trying to eat as much as possible at the expense of others, each person tries to do as little as possible for the same pay. Productivity per employee will fall, while pay increases. Unions have overhead, and those who run the union profit like the restaurant owner, requiring everyone to split the bill. If you were to construct a union, then it should be governed by the principles of a true democracy. Exploitation is subjective and assumes the employer is profiting, quote, excessively off others' labor. it is difficult to measure the extent to which any individual employee is profiting a company. We could estimate that employee compensation to productivity rate follows a Pareto distribution, which means some employees are highly exploited on one side and others are net costs to the business. In general, the business owner has incentive to identify and fire people who are a net loss, except in cases of nepotism or shareholder fraud. Management defrauding shareholders through compensation plans is another example of moral hazard. Let me check Float. We are live streaming to Float as well. I don't want to forget you guys. Shout out to Float. The only thing we do know is that all wealth is created by the power of people, and that the consequence of the prisoner's dilemma is the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. Is this surplus wealth the result of the legitimate hard work and risk-taking of the company owner? Did the owner really take all the risks if it was a company with limited liability? Are all of the externalized costs of the business accounted for, or are they passed on to the population? What about the societal cost of individual dependency created by full-time employment relationships? Can a true democracy sustain itself with a population of employees dependent upon corporate overlords? Okay, well that is, overlord implies non-consent, which would be a problem in and of itself. But I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think he's using a word that applies to non-consent to a consensual thing, which I think is imprecise. One thing is certain. Hiring the person willing to work for the lowest pay is the most economically efficient thing to do. It will consume the least wealth and produce the most wealth. That person is in most need of the job and has the fewest other opportunities to produce value for society. However, the wealth produced is concentrated, and the concentration is what leads to the natural Pareto distribution of wealth. In summary, employees are not being exploited just because an employer gains 10x the value they pay in salary, and any attempt to unionize will ultimately fail society due to moral hazard. A society looking to level the playing field could require some form of equity compensation or profit sharing with employees. Okay, well, that suggests coercion, but okay. Maybe not. Maybe they would... I mean, look, if all of us in Dallas got together and said, look, we're not going to spend a dime at any restaurant that doesn't, conform to these wishes, that's not coercive. Okay, go for it. Give it a try. This is also challenging because often the profits are derived from the business owner's investments in capital, backhoes, and any forced profit sharing with employees would be tantamount to making employees partial owner of a backhoe they didn't have to pay for. Overthrowing democracy with economic power. In a society with relatively stable social order and property rights, economic power can be utilized by the wealthy to gain political power. Oh boy. This is achieved through a process of building dependence. Once dependence is achieved, then the generative power of the people can be exploited by someone else. Consider someone who works the same job for 30 years. He has become dependent upon his employer and will find that his skills may no longer be flexible enough to be productive anywhere else. The employer lacks incentive to increase pay and can capture more and more of the productive power of the employee. In order to gain independence, the employee needs to go through a period of low income and underemployment, while he learns how to produce value without his lifelong employer. Remco's on 300 megabit here. I think it's your codec. Yeah, I'm sending 3000 kilobit. So I'm sending the same thing to YouTube and everywhere else. There's got to be some sort of got to be some infrastructure behind the scenes that's not keeping up. I apologize for that. I guess next stream I do Odysee, I'll try lowering it even more and just see if that helps people. I don't know. Maybe they have it capped at something lower than what I'm sending. Maybe Odysee has sort of put a limit on the maximum bitrate that they'll allow streams at. I don't know. I'll have to try and play with it and see. I mean, if you need to, go over and watch it on YouTube. For now, YouTube or Float or DLive or Facebook or Periscope or whatever. We're going everywhere. Where was I? If they're unable to accumulate sufficient savings to survive a period of underemployment, then they become enslaved, and their own power is producing the wealth that enables their enslavement. Look, there's no such thing as consensual enslavement. I'm not going to harp on that again. I've already ranted about it 4 times. Moving on. Imagine you are lucky enough to live in a true democracy, where the rules of relative power, low coupling, and high encapsulation are in play, and where political playoffs keep power from flowing to the same people. What would happen if everyone worked for the same company? What would happen if someone accumulated so much wealth that they could buy themselves to the top of the playoffs? What if so many people became dependent upon a company? Well, they couldn't. What if so many people became dependent upon a company that their dependence corrupted their will for independence? The people may choose to bail out the institutions that enslave them rather than maintaining the true democracy. It is clear that corporatism is a threat to true democracy, and that any true democracy must establish rules and culture that defend against this failure mode. This is not so easy when you consider that companies are just an alternative means of creating voluntary communities. Thank you. A company is a... Sorry, I paused to think from time to time, so... Sorry for the dead silence. This is my read time, so... A company is a group of people following a consensus process with a leader chosen by the shareholders. I mean, that's one form of a company, okay. If one person owns 51% of the shares, then a company is a kingdom without land, unless you count IP as virtual land. The king is interested in growing his kingdom, and he does this by increasing the number of people he can leverage. The more productive his citizens, employees... I don't like the conflation of involuntary kingship, kinghood, and voluntary employment. We're erasing consent here in a wanton fashion I'm not okay with, but moving on. The king is interested in growing his kingdom, and he does this by increasing the number of people he can leverage. The more productive his citizens, employees, are, the richer his kingdom grows. The king owns all the land, property of the business, and the employees work the land for a salary. In effect, the corporate structure and charter is very similar to feudalism, and employees are the serfs. Jesus Christ. I cannot believe he doesn't see the difference. One is coercive and non-consensual, the other is not. They are not very similar at all. Intellectual property and business licenses are the new land monopolies, aka the fiefs. That you have a point, because IP and business licenses in modern times are all coercive. Perhaps the one minor difference is that employees can often change companies. However, as companies get bigger, they do work to minimize the ability of employees to move to competitors. Well, that's true. A democracy can elect a king, but the structure of democracy can elect a king. I don't know about this. Whatever. But the structure of society can still be feudal in nature if corporations are allowed to grow up and monopolize industries by their sheer size and the people's dependence upon them for both employment and products. Part of any peace treaty must be measures to defend against the growth of large companies. This could be viewed as a generalized antitrust system. If the principles of true democracy are followed, then each community would be taking measures to protect its own independence. Those measures can include banning or taxing imports from corporations the same way they would ban imports from a foreign empire. Likewise, it would limit exports of labor to any corporate entity that gets too big. A large company could be viewed as a foreign community and its employees as members of another community. In this case, you cannot be a member of your local community and work as an employee of a company not owned by members of your local community. I mean, I feel like we just hit a major wall in this plan. Look, like, let me finish this chapter. I'm going to hold this rant for a little while. Large corporate giants do not exist under a true democracy. This has massive consequences for people adapted to the chains of modern conveniences. Yes. Economies of scale allow the manufacturing processes that require tens of billions of dollars to be invested in factories. If we prevent large companies from growing up, then these factories may never be created, and we may never have iPhones. This isn't exactly true. The world would only gain iPhones once the productive capacity of a small community of 50,000 people accumulated the productive capital to sponsor their own iPhone manufacturing center, largely independent from the rest of the world. Apple is one of the largest companies in the world by valuation, and it operates by creating a highly coupled, tightly integrated ecosystem. They control everything from the chip manufacturing to the payment method. Once you enter their ecosystem, it is relatively more difficult to interoperate with products from outside their system. As Apple grows, they push competitors out of their ecosystem. Those who wish to remain pay a 30% Apple tax to access Apple's customers. Apple, it's not a tax if it's voluntary. Again, this is... Okay, anyway. Apple is a case study in building an independent community. The community is governed by King Cook, who inherited the kingdom from King Jobs. Kings are coercive? Again, we're just willy-nilly with consent. These things are totally different. One is forceful and violent and threatening, and the other is not. I don't like the constant conflation. Worrying, it's red flag. Hackles are up every single time. Apple creates incentives for people to stay within their walled garden and aggressively pursues vertical integration of their supply chain. This is an example of a large, non-democratic, voluntary community. Yeah, voluntary. So it's not King Cook and King Jobs, and it's not a tax. It's voluntary. Society empowers companies like Apple by granting them monopolies via intellectual property. Okay. That is coercion. So to that extent, I do stand corrected. But it's not society empowering companies. Society is a concept that doesn't do shit. So individuals working in government with guns create this concept called intellectual property and will attack people on Apple's behalf. That's what's actually happening. And so in that regard, companies like Apple controlling other people with the guns of government using this concept of intellectual property does make them coercive, which now in that light, in that vertical, you could call him King Cook and King Jobs. And I don't know about the Apple tax, but yeah, at least that, to that degree, I stand corrected. That is coercion. Agreed. Corporatism is largely countered by true democracies protecting the independence of their people. Society can eventually provide many of the goods and services provided by large companies, but it would have to innovate the ability to do so in a more decentralized manner. Giving into the temptation to advance technology as quickly as possible through the creation of large corporations is one of the fastest ways to lose a true democracy and become enslaved to corporate interests by our desire for comfort. Again, it's not enslavement if it's voluntary. There seems to be a total blind spot to things that entail force versus things that do not. I don't know why. That is the end of this chapter. Let me back up to that one that I had an issue with. Banning or taxing imports from corporations the same way they would ban imports from a foreign empire. Likewise, it would limit exports of labor to any corporate entity that gets too big. Imagine, just imagine, wanting to move into a neighborhood, then you find out the neighborhood has an HOA, and you're like, okay, well, this HOA is probably just going to make sure that my grass doesn't get too long, or that, I don't let my fence fall into disrepair. And then you get a copy of the bylaws before you buy the house, and you realize that this HOA wants to have a say in who you can work for. And that at any time, if the members of the HOA vote and decide that the company you work for has grown problematically large for them, they're going to shut that down. And you have a choice. You can either sell your house and leave the neighborhood, or quit your job. Are you going to move into that neighborhood? Come on. Like, I made this point to Mike earlier. It's like, I already have, the next house I buy, I guarantee you will not have an HOA, because I'm so sick of these little micro tyrants, and all the limit of their power is the length of my fucking grass, and they're already so miserable to deal with. I would rather not live in this neighborhood. I would rather not have even people lording their little micro control over the length of my grass. You think I'm going to give an association of people like this micro control over literally who I associate with for my job? I don't think so. That seems incredibly unwise. I can't even imagine doing that. I mean, hey, if it's voluntary, if you want to move into the HOA, I'm not saying that I'm going to stop you, or that anybody should be able to use force to stop you from that kind of voluntary activity. But goddamn, that seems really dumb. That seems like a dumb thing to consider moving into that HOA. In this case, you cannot be a member of your local community and work as an employee of a company not owned by members of your local community. You have destroyed specialization of labor. You have destroyed division of labor in an effort to become, I mean, like, modern technology development grinds to a halt. iPhone doesn't exist. Like, advanced technology that we have today would not exist today. Absolutely would not exist today. Would it ever exist? How much longer would it take for 50,000 people to develop even a small percentage of the modern conveniences that we use to be even more productive today? This is an exponential decrease in productivity that he's discussing here. That is the biggest problem with this book I've seen thus far. I mean, I understand the principles behind it too. Like, if you can get 50,000 people together to be totally self-sufficient, then they're more autonomous for sure, and that makes them more free to make decisions than otherwise. But I'm not sure this is the answer. At least from that, like, employment, company running perspective, that's a big problem. All right, next chapter. Allocating natural resources. As a kid, my parents taught my brother and me how to split a cookie without disputes. If my parents split a cookie and then distributed the pieces, we would fight over who got what half. It was impossible to ever split it perfectly, and so there was always a dispute. My parents got tired of having to resolve the dispute, so they gave us a new strategy. One of us would be given the task of dividing the cookie. The other would have the right to choose which half they wanted. To decide who was the divider and who was a chooser, we would either flip a coin or take turns. The result of this algorithm is that the divider would be meticulously fair, because the chooser is assumed to pick the better half. By agreeing to this algorithm, there were no more disputes, and therefore we didn't need a higher authority to resolve disputes for us. You could say that we had a moral hazard-free algorithm for building consensus and avoiding a physical altercation under the law of the jungle. One of the biggest disputes facing humanity is how to allocate the world's resources. Unlike my brother and me, humanity doesn't have an option of letting our parents settle it for us. I think it's time for a warning. This chapter can easily trigger those of the capitalist, socialist, and communist perspective. The concept of property is very closely tied to our identity, and therefore any discussion that calls into question what we believe is ours is viewed as a threat against our person. I heavily debated excluding this chapter from this book because of how easily the ideas presented can be used to lump me into a preconceived category. I therefore ask you to keep in mind that I fundamentally believe in voluntary trade, voluntary association, and voluntary membership in a community, and all rules should be limited to an opt-in community. Okay, well, okay. 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 Keep in mind, he fundamentally believes in voluntary trade, association, and membership in a community, and rules should be limited to an opt-in community. The voluntary, consent-based process should be appealing to the capitalists. That said, what I'm about to present suggests that rational people voluntarily submit to something that could be interpreted as somewhat socialist or communist if one clings too tightly to their notions of property. Uh-oh. Well, if it's voluntary, it's not communism. After much thinking, I stumbled upon a rational, logically consistent theory of property allocation. I asked myself a fundamental question. How do we allocate the natural, unearned resources of the universe fairly across all generations? How do we allocate unearned resources? Why is it important to earn resources? And who is this we that are doing the allocation? The answer to this question is critical for people attempting to negotiate rights via a community peace treaty. Without a good answer, you might inadvertently agree to an unbalanced or unsustainable treaty. It would be like my brother tricking me into picking the smaller piece of the cookie, or Jacob offering Esau a bowl of stew in exchange for his birthright. This question is a challenge even for libertarians because it gets to the very heart of property rights. How do we determine what's yours and what's mine? Where do these rights come from? Libertarians hold that taking property without permission is an act of aggression, and from this conclude that taxation is an act of aggression. However, for it to be an act of aggression, the libertarian must first establish the basis of their claim to the property. Who owns the moon, the ocean, the land, and the air? Do Adam and Eve have eternal property right to 50% of the earth? Each? Or does Adam own the world because he was here first? What I mean by this is that they get to choose which of their children get their property when they die. Their children get to decide how to divide it among their children, and so on until the present day. If Cain kills Abel, does he get to keep Abel's property? What about Cain's descendants? Does proving clean title to property require documenting all transfers back to Genesis? This, after all, is the basis of cryptocurrency property. All transfers are logged in a publicly verifiable ledger, and the bitcoins are only yours by virtue of the ability to track ownership back to the Genesis block. It should be obvious that proving clear title to anything is impossible. Furthermore, one must ask the question, why do Adam and Eve have the right to control the definition of legitimate ownership of property for all eternity? Is each new generation bound to recognize the property rights allocated by the prior generation? Is first come, first serve a proper basis for assigning initial ownership to unowned property? Does this generation have the right to consume all the oil in rainforests, then pass the profits down to their favorite children? Does this generation have the right to allocate all the mineral rights for all of eternity? These are the questions that led me to consider an alternative approach to property rights. Well, all of those questions have answers. Not like singular answers, but good and practical and workable answers. Let's see what he's going to say. Most people have an innate sense of justice that starts as a child. We have an idea of what we consider ours. This generally includes things we touched first, things we created, or things we saw first. From this, it flows to things we bought from others. On top of this foundation, we introduce contracts, which represent mutual agreements between people on if, how, and when property titles transfer. While some people naturally respect other people's property and contracts, other people choose to follow the might makes right approach to property. This is the law of the jungle, and is what has largely governed how property is allocated via theft, wars, and taxation. In the jungle, possession is 9/10 of the law. In the jungle, this is me talking, property doesn't exist. In practice, most property rights are actually driven by respecting the status quo. What was yours yesterday is yours today. If you can maintain control over property for long enough, then people forget how you obtained it, and it becomes yours. I find all of the above systems to be logically inconsistent. Before one can contract for property, one must own it. Force, fraud, theft, and extortion are not valid means to acquire property under a peace treaty. Systems set up by mutual consent in one generation cannot be binding on subsequent generations because contracts are only valid if the parties have the ability to consent and are negotiating as equals. I don't think the negotiating as equals part has anything to do with a valid contract. It's consent. Consent and property ownership. Future generations could not consent and weren't around to negotiate. To argue otherwise is to assume that the child is forever sold into the slavery of her parents' contracts. It's not slavery. It is clear that in practice, property is allocated by the law of the jungle. Okay, property is not allocated by the law of the jungle. Property doesn't exist in the law of the jungle, what I call the state of nature. State of nature is people do what they want, people do what they have the power to do, people do what they have the power to get away with doing, they take what they want to take. That is the absence of property rights. That is the absence of a system of property. That is the absence of any moral philosophy. Once we recognize property, then we are elevating ourselves out of a state of nature. When someone steals from you, they are attempting to drag you down into the state of nature, and you need to deal with them in their world where property doesn't exist. That's what self-defense is. A person you would not normally be able to attack, you are able to attack when they steal from you or attack you, because they are removing themselves. They are they're de-elevating themselves back down into the state of nature, or as he would say, the jungle. And so if a person wishes to associate with you on those terms, then who are they to complain when you associate with them back in their own terms? Back to the book. The strongest parties conquer the weaker. The victors write the history books and redefine property rights. Property rights are enforced by violence or the threat thereof. No. Property rights are peaceful, consensual, reciprocal agreements between people. When you move into needing to enforce a property right, you are no longer dealing with property, you are no longer dealing with rights, you are back down in the state of nature. You're not dealing with property anymore, or people that have rights or deserve them. You're in the state of nature, defending, attempting to use your might to overcome the might of the other person to make things how you would prefer it to be. Any new system of property rights must account for this natural tendency of mankind and should gradually correct for such misconduct rather than compound it. That said, classifying war, theft, and fraud as misconduct assumes an existing peace treaty, and under the law of the jungle, such misconduct is neither more good nor bad than a shark eating another fish. From the perspective of a community where all rights being are... This might be a typo. From the perspective of a community where all rights being are derived from a peace treaty among consenting, independent individuals, we must ask ourselves, how should we negotiate? The goal of negotiating is to reach peace, and to have lasting peace, knowing that we negotiated from a position of theoretically equal strength. Let's apply the lesson of brothers dividing a cookie to the task of property rights. Imagine that mankind had to come up with a system for allocating property rights that fully accounts for all generations. Imagine you were tasked with the job of dividing the universe among individuals in all generations, and that someone who doesn't like you got to decide which slice you get and which generation you are born into. Would you give the first generation the right to allocate to future generations? Would you give the victor the spoils of war? Would you want to leave it up to chance? Historically speaking, the odds would not be in your favor of getting the better piece of the cookie. Yeah, I can't help with the buffering on Odysee today. I don't know what's going on with their infrastructure. Sorry, guys, you'll have to watch over on YouTube or Float or DLive or Facebook or... Not Facebook. Don't do that. Facebook is gross. It is through pondering this question that I came up with a process for universal inheritance. I assume that each day is a new day, and each generation deserves an equal division of the unearned natural resources of the universe. A billionaire who acquired his riches extracting oil from the ground denies future generations those resources, and the wealth earned is passed on to his kids. All wealth is derived from the natural unearned resources extracted in the past and traded amongst prior generations. I thought all wealth was derived from manpower. All wealth is derived from the natural unearned resources extracted in the past and traded amongst prior generations. Sure, people mix their labor with things to make the natural resources more valuable, but that doesn't negate their dependence upon the natural resources. Okay. It is physically impossible and a nonsense statement to say you mix your labor with things. Labor is not tangible. It cannot be mixed with things. This is one of the bad Lockean ideas that that I talk about frequently when I'm boiling down the Lockean property norms. Yeah, guys, I don't think it's on your end. I think it's on Odyssee's sort of infrastructure end. So, yeah. Let's see. Many of these resources are consumed in the process and no longer exist. All that remains are other forms of wealth accumulated by the consumption of oil, soil fertility, and rainforests. In order to keep things fair between generations, I propose that each person should be lent a share of the Earth's resources for the duration of a long human life. This is based upon the premise that members in one generation would never agree to give the previous generation more favorable terms, assuming all generations were represented by competent attorneys. From this perspective, each year, some percentage of the Earth's resources should be redistributed to the current generation such that over one lifetime the resources, wealth, are passed fairly, evenly, from one generation to the next. If we assume most people live less than 100 years, then the resulting rate of inheritance should be around 5% per year. This would redistribute 99.5% of initial wealth over 100 years. This redistribution is nothing more than a loan repayment by one generation and a loan issuance to the next. I mean, my note in the margin is this is insane. Efficiency of allocation to those that can best utilize resources gets destroyed along with modern society. That was my note. And just to expound on that, like the oil in the ground was worth very little before someone figured out how to make it very valuable. So the people that came after him didn't do that. So you want to talk about unearned wealth? Well, the people that came after the guy that figured out how to make oil extremely valuable, they haven't earned any wealth from that natural resource. Things don't have inherent value. And so there isn't even a baseline lowest common denominator value of that oil that was in the ground. It's the one guy or the people, whoever worked together to figure out how to use oil that made it valuable. It has nothing to do with people that don't exist yet. Unfortunately, not all wealth is fungible and divisible. How do you divide the Mona Lisa? Furthermore, there is no unit of value, as all value is in the eye of the beholder. Yes, correct. It isn't possible to establish an objective value for the Mona Lisa. Given the lack of algorithmic solutions to handle all classes of wealth, we are left with the challenge of reaching an imperfect political consensus that respects the principle that all people inherit an equal share for 100 years. If a group of people were to come together and establish a new peace treaty, aka constitution, how would they know what is fair to ask for? Armed with the logic of dividing the universe fairly over generations, people would expect some kind of universal inheritance to pass property from generation to generation. A simple way to implement a universal loan of resources is to issue the community currency evenly to all people in the community. Every year the currency supply would grow by 5%, and the newly issued currency would be divided among the parties to the Community Peace Treaty. Since currency is effectively a claim on future resources, this inflation would seamlessly and transparently implement the principle of universal inheritance. Another way to augment this is to implement a property tax system for real estate and distribute the proceeds evenly to all parties to the peace treaty. Still another is to require that all companies auction off 5% of their equity every year, which could be viewed as the price of limited liability. None of these ideas are perfect, but they are a step toward implementing a fair transfer of assets from generation to generation, as if implementing a straight 5% wealth tax. Welfare has never caused any... This is me talking. This is my notes in the margin. Welfare has never caused any societal problems. Lol. File this under moral hazard problems. I mean, that's not a very strong counter-argument. I don't have much room in the margins to jot notes down. Economic stability. A community needs to have a set of rules which is stable over time, or it will eventually collapse. A concentration of wealth is a form of power and is distributed among society via a Pareto distribution. In a free market with voluntary trade, capital and power will concentrate to gain larger economies of scale and efficiency. This brings down prices for everyone, but concentrates wealth. So wealth is a form of power, which is earned by trade rather than votes. My note in the margin is, okay, at this point in the book, everything has been called power. History has demonstrated that attempts to equalize wealth via communism fail. It makes everyone but the ruling class equally impoverished and can only be enforced by a tyranny. People will revert to the law of the jungle in a violent revolution after enough time spent under a communist ruling class. History has also demonstrated that when capitalist wealth inequality reaches extreme Pareto ratios, instead of 80-20, it becomes closer to 90-10 or 99-1, the people revolt, and the revolt is usually led by communists. The communist rulers will campaign on redistributing the wealth to raise everyone's standard of living, but in the process actually concentrate wealth in the form of power further and fail to deliver on their promises. Wealth and power are tightly coupled, and any peace treaty must take measures to ensure that neither wealth nor power concentrates beyond a healthy Pareto distribution. This means that you cannot concentrate power in the name of decentralizing wealth, nor can you allow the concentration of wealth to such an extent that it creates self-reinforcing concentration of power. This ping-pong between extreme wealth inequality and extreme power inequality prevents society from achieving its full potential because it self-destructs. Society seems to be most stable with a large middle class and a more conservative Pareto distribution, perhaps 70-30. Any peace treaty should factor in the need to protect from both extreme communism and extreme wealth inequality. It's for this reason that a flat wealth tax, whose proceeds are distributed evenly among the population, can make sense. The algorithmic redistribution is designed to prevent the tax revenue from empowering special interests and central planners. This cannot be overstated, because communism typically fails because rulers take a large cut of the wealth they tax, which increases their power. An algorithmic redistribution denies rulers that power and therefore rebalances wealth without concentrating power. An effect of such a wealth tax is that there is an equilibrium where the amount you pay in wealth tax equals the benefit you receive from equal distribution. This means that the vast majority of people would not pay net wealth tax. It also means that those with wealth must use it productively to generate enough income to pay the property tax, or they will gradually lose it. This maximizes the utilization of assets for growing the productivity of society while minimizing the creation of a government bureaucracy. It becomes a tax on unproductive assets. So basically, commies are going to be violent, therefore pay them off. I hate that. No thanks. I don't want to pay off the commies, keep them from being violent. There are consequences to implementing a basic inheritance which must be acknowledged. When you give people an inheritance, they may be inclined to live in near poverty rather than work. Yes, correct. There is a marginal utility on your income where the first dollar earned is worth far more than the millionth. There is also a marginal utility on your free time. In a world without a basic income, someone must trade their free time to work for money. In this case, they are working for their first dollar, which is their most valuable dollar, because without it, they die. Once they have given up their time, it makes sense to maximize productivity. After all, if you must work hard 8 hours per day, you might as well work hard for $50 per hour instead of $10 per hour. Either way, you are paying the same price, 8 hours of hard work. However, if you got the equivalent income to $5 per hour but didn't have to work hard, then working hard for $10 or even $50 might be less appealing than not having to work at all for only $5 per hour. In effect, the cost of going from $5 per hour of free inheritance to $55 per hour is 8 hours of hard work. The marginal utility of an extra $50 per hour could very well be less than the cost of 8 hours of hard work. That was expertly explained. That is an economic concept that a lot of people need to figure out that support minimum wage laws. That was really well explained. Well done, well done. This can be observed throughout the country by the difficulty in finding skilled tradesmen to do hard work in an environment with record unemployment. A community could find that the disincentive to do hard work reduces total wealth production and ultimately reduces the inheritance to a point where people have to do hard work to survive. We're experiencing a version of this now with all the COVID welfare happening, like fast food restaurants are having difficulty finding low-wage employees to do the work because everybody's getting so much goddamn welfare. Stolen money from the productive. The commies are being overpaid. That was a joke. For this reason, a wise community should tie the inheritance to matching earned income. You must earn $5 through full-time hard work before you can claim $5 of your inheritance from the community. Anyone who isn't gainfully employed would not qualify for an inheritance. Okay, come on. That'll be gamed. Out of the gate, somebody will set up some kind of employment that matches that somehow to check the box with the least common denominator welfare level of effort. From the perspective of negotiation of a peace treaty across generations, Adam and Eve had to toil long hours just to survive and improve their standard of living. They may have inherited the world, but they still had to pay the price of hard work. It follows that all generations should have to pay the same price of hard work so that they do not get the better end of the deal. After all, if you were cutting the cookie and had to choose between an equal share of 10,000 BCE and an equal share of 2020, which would you pick? Which would demand more hard labor from you just to survive? The reality is that a productive society will naturally create surpluses, which benefit the next generation. The reality is that a productive society will naturally create surpluses which benefit the next generation. This is required for humanity to thrive and grow. we shouldn't attempt to limit future generations in an attempt to make everyone equal. Isn't that what we were just talking about doing? Any more than we should attempt to make everyone equal in this generation. The reality is that a productive society will naturally create surpluses which benefit that. Then you don't need to tax people to give it to them, to benefit the next generation. I've benefited greatly from the private ownership of the people that came before. They invented the gasoline engine and the air conditioner and the computer that you're hearing me through right now. I don't want welfare from them. We shouldn't attempt to limit future generations in an attempt to make everyone equal any more than we should attempt to make everyone equal in this generation. Okay, 3 pages ago, he said, each year some percentage of the Earth's resources should be redistributed to the current generation, such that over one lifetime the resources are passed fairly from one generation to the next. Oh, sorry, I missed the parentheses. Earth's resources should be redistributed to the current generation such that over one lifetime the resources, wealth, are passed fairly, evenly, from one generation to the next. Fast forward 2 pages. We shouldn't attempt to limit future generations in an attempt to make everyone equal any more than we should attempt to make everyone equal in this generation. I don't know, man. No thanks. Not for me. While it is true that a certain percentage of the population will squander their resources, it is equally true that the wealthy also squander resources. Arguments based on efficiency are biased towards some other property rights system. The presumption is that somebody, by virtue of their own biased values, knows how to allocate resources better than everyone else. Like the author of this book? That's not a counter-argument. That's just a snarky comment, probably not worth saying. The presumption is that certain economic goods and experiences are better than others. The presumption is that today's rich have earned it by virtue of their own intelligence and can invest it better. I wouldn't say intelligence, I would say choices. The presumption is that today's rich have earned it by virtue of their own choices, and the fact that they can invest it better is proven by them having had already done so. The presumption is that one end of the bell curve, which wastes resources given to them, outweighs the other end of the bell curve, which uses them in far more productive means. The presumption is that a few rich central planners can better invest resources than can entrepreneurs serving the masses who vote on the products and services they desire by spending their inheritance. In other words, economic efficiency is a biased argument used to justify a biased status quo. It presupposes certain goals are higher than other goals. It assumes that some people do not have a right to participate in influencing which goods and services are provided. In effect, a universal inheritance becomes democratization of economic voting rights in the market. I don't know about that. All of a sudden, the libertarians who are arguing for a status quo property rights system where there is no cost to maintain ownership start sounding like central planning statists who know better how to run the economy? This is an absurd accusation. To think that a lack of coercion plus respect for property is, quote, central planning, statism, is some... Let me be calm. Not exactly the most coherent thing to say. The irony is that a wealth tax is also central planning. So we are all guilty of central planning. Nice try. Nope. I'm an individual. I do not plan for anyone, nor do I advocate that there be some central planning for everyone. So no, we're not all guilty of central planning. The only thing that isn't centrally planned is the law of the jungle, in which case there is no property except that which you can physically defend. Yeah, that's the same thing as saying that there's no property in the law of the jungle. That's just fighting. Might makes right. Yeah. Any system which allows wealth inequality to grow too far will ultimately revert to the law of the jungle as the poor rise up and burn the place down. Pay off the poor. A gradual wealth redistribution is likely to create a more stable and prosperous society than one which goes through violent turmoil every couple of generations. A single world war or genocide can set humanity back centuries of progress, especially when you consider the impact of compounding returns. What would your inheritance buy? I'm going to finish this chapter. We got 2 pages left. Total global real estate is worth about $217 trillion distributed among 7 billion people, or about $1,500 per person per year. Total global stocks are about 100 trillion, or $1,200 per person per year. Total worldwide money supply is about 100 trillion and rapidly growing. All told, this would give everyone, including the billions of poor and starving individuals in Africa, India, and China, a total income of about $4,000 per year, or $333 per month. This is greater than the global median per capita household income. This is over 4 times the median income in Africa. Talk about impacting worldwide poverty. Talk about impacting worldwide poverty. Yeah, I had that right. Obviously, implementing such a distribution process globally is difficult and not very appealing to citizens of wealthier industrialized countries. That said, if we applied the same process to only the assets and citizens of the United States, we would arrive at a number around $15,000 per year, which would instantly place everyone above the poverty line until a new price equilibrium is reached. The point of this discussion is to demonstrate that using a process derived from first principles. He said those words a lot in this book, and I don't know what he means by them. I don't think it's the same thing philosophers mean by them, so I don't know what that means. We can derive a basic income that is in the same ballpark as what is often proposed. Furthermore, we can do so by not asking how much money is needed, but by asking how much wealth is available to pass on to the next generation at 5% per year. To summarize, a wealth tax of 5% per year would give everyone an income above the poverty line without violating the fairly negotiated property rights of any generation. This wealth tax in the USA would mean anyone with assets less than $300,000 of value would, in effect, pay no tax, as their tax would be equal to their inheritance. This means almost 75% of Americans would effectively pay no wealth tax because their inheritance would be greater than their tax liability. Furthermore, those with assets above $300K in value are likely earning more than 5% of passive income from those assets. Those who do not use their assets productively by earning more than 5% will slowly lose them to the next generation over the course of their life. Given that everyone would be above the poverty line, there would no longer be any need for other welfare services, means testing, etc. School tuition could easily be paid from the basic income of children. Child support orders could be eliminated. Need is not a basis for property rights. Almost half of Americans support a universal basic income, UBI, but existing books on the topic approach the concept from a need-based approach. The needs-based approach to UBI naturally repulses those who are against the welfare state, especially libertarians. Existing libertarian arguments in support of a UBI tend to focus on a lesser of evils justification, rather than deriving an argument from first principles. namely that UBI is better than existing high overhead welfare systems. Political philosophers and economists have proposed many different implementations of UBI, almost all of which will end in hyperinflation and economic destruction. The needs-based argument for UBI creates an unsustainable economic chain of events where UBI triggers price increases, which trigger additional needs-based increases to UBI. It is possible to support a universal inheritance supported by a wealth tax while being a logically consistent, economically sound libertarian. In fact, it may be the only logically consistent theory of property rights that could be broadly accepted by the masses, while automatically correcting for past and injustices. On the other hand, this nuanced position might be lost on the masses who would not understand the reason behind their inheritance. Without a proper understanding, the masses may simply call for more whenever their inheritance doesn't support the standard of living they want. Through their own ignorance and selfish desires, the masses can quickly turn a stable economic system, 5% per year, into an unstable communist system that forces everyone to the lowest common denominator. Only through continuous education and affirming from one generation to the next can people hope to create and maintain such a system without falling victim to philosophical corruption. All property rights are derived from a peace treaty agreed to by independent parties able to negotiate freely with the ability to say no. A wise society negotiates a peace treaty that is sustainable across many generations and doesn't get undermined as the balance of power among the parties to the treaty evolves over time. So to keep with where he began this chapter, to keep in alignment with the commitment to voluntary, what was that? Let me see if I can find it. I fundamentally believe in voluntary trade, voluntary association, and voluntary membership in a community, and all rules should be limited to an opt-in community. To keep in line with that, I cannot call this crypto-communism, which was my initial reaction, and then what I wrote down on the page. This is crypto-communism. But if it's voluntary, then it is not communism. It would require everyone to consent to it for it to be consensual, and that makes it not really communistic. And I think, let's be practical, that ain't happening. You're not getting everybody to consent to being taxed 5%. And you're going to have a lot of communities, if nothing else. Let's say that the world becomes full of communities that follow some of the precepts of this book. You're going to have a lot of those communities that just don't participate in that wealth redistribution stuff. And I'm not sure that sort of fractal nature of the difference in the different kinds of communities has been folded into the thinking in this structure. Maybe it has, I don't know. Distributing money from the rich to the poor through percent, this is another note I wrote, through percent-based makes the poor people the more equal than others because their ownership is more secure than those that have earned or that own more. Yeah. In that light it does. Being born is not something that entitles you to anything more than your body property, so long as you can keep it, is another note that I wrote. Yeah, I don't think there's some threshold across which jealousy justifies aggression. Commies. And I don't think the right answer is to negotiate with terrorists by paying them off. I don't know, I could be wrong. I guess the real question is, if you had a menu of communities like this to join, you would get to decide for yourself which of those communities you thought was the most deserving of your membership. Would you pick a community that didn't have these voluntary so-called taxes? Would you pick a community that did or didn't have this 5% in wealth inflation? Or would you pick communities that didn't control who you could work for and inflate your currency? I'm struggling to think of somebody that I'm struggling to think of many people that would move into a taxed, inflated currency community. And the communities that don't have those things would outcompete communities that do, in at least the short to medium term. I mean, like, you could argue that there's a chance that long term something will happen to those communities that will make them less resilient because they haven't implemented those taxes. But you know, for the 200 years until that random event happens, the communities that don't have those things are going to outcompete and outperform the communities that do. And that means you're going to have 2 to 3 human lifespans. And you'd be asking those 2 to 3 human lifespans, generations of people, to sacrifice for future generations, you know, in ways that, you know, they'll never see the benefit of. Only future generations will. I don't think that's going to be a cost benefit that you're going to be able to sell to many people. Okay, well, I'm going to leave it there today, guys. We've been reading for a while. Let me see. How are we doing on this book? Well, we have about 25% of the book left, so we made a lot of ground today. Hope you guys are enjoying this. If you are, please, you know, do the like and drop a thanks in the comments or something so that I can know you guys are enjoying these Let's Reads. I think I am. So with that said, I will see you guys next time. I might do some game streaming later today. We'll see how it goes. Have a good one.